Heyo, how's everybody doing today? This is Skender and I am the host of the Medtech Business Academy podcast, hosted by my colleague and dear friend Barbara Strain. We are proud to present to you another edition of this early fall Medtech Business Academy. We are recording in early fall 2024. Yes, I said early fall. It's hard to believe that. God. It's almost going to be the end of October pretty soon, and Halloween. It's crazy how fast it goes. Anyway, as everybody knows, we typically in MedTech, there are two sprints of seasons when it relates to activity. They tend to be spring and fall. We have that winter season where things get a little quieter as people deal with their seasonal depression. And then we have summer where everybody's dealing with the how do I get away from it all. So spring and summer tend to be those areas where we sprint. And that also happens to be a time where we jam in all of these conferences and trade shows to try and support all the education that we're all going to be lucky to receive and network with our colleagues. Well, we are in such a sprint right now, but Barbara and I were talking about this off camera, and it feels like this year's sprint is even more of a sprint than we've ever seen. There are companies that we're seeing right now that are piling over each other forward and back to get things done. And it's exciting. And if you look at the macroeconomic picture of what's happening in the industry, we're seeing procedure volume up, we're seeing margins up, we're seeing gross revenues up, and that's on the provider side, that's on the industry side. All these things are increasing. So there is merit. Conversely, when you look at some of the macroeconomic picture, as we speak right now, inflation seems to have settled in. We have a rate environment that seems to be more favorable towards business and then some. So there is the capacity where some of that dry powder capital that was left on the sidelines is probably going to be put to use here, particularly in 2025, which is going to spur even more growth. However, we're coming off of a period where there was a lot of downsizing. And so what happens now and what we're seeing is the fact that a lot of these organizations are trying to make up for all this new capacity and new opportunity, but with smaller staff. And it's presenting a challenge and it's a strain on the representatives that are there right now. So today's podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about the dynamic of what's going on, what's causing all this running. Okay. And why is everybody sprinting? What are the causes of that? And then further to that, we're going to talk a little bit about the insource outsource paradigm, because I think a lot of companies struggle with that. So with that, we welcome everybody to the Medtech Business Academy. So Barbara, what are your thoughts on why is there, as we sit here in the fall of 2024, and right now we're in the beginning of October, why do you feel like there's such a sprint this year more so than there has been in other years?
So there's a sprint on both sides, from the providers as well as suppliers. I think the providers are getting their wings, basically. They got their feet on the ground. They're a little more settled than they were at the first of the year. There's a lot of M&A still going on, but it's kind of settled down a little bit. But there's a lot of CEO movement, CFO movement, a variety of things, because everybody's looking for what can we really do to sort of clean up waste out of a variety of areas. And a lot of that is personnel, but it has to be cleverly done, sort of like carving the turkey that's going to be coming up soon, or whatever you do for Thanksgiving. But on the manufacturer side, they're seeing the gaps in care more readily because there's more data available. They're using AI. Both providers and manufacturers are using more AI. So it's coming up and sort of hitting them in the head saying, we've looked at all this. Here's where you should focus regionally. Here's where you should focus on the type of products because of the different procedures and things that are being done. Here's what's happening on chronic diseases and all the top things we've been looking at. So the manufacturers are trying to fill that hole. And even though the they're up in margin a little bit in things. They're trying to make up for the rest of 2024 and try to get some stability to get through to 2025 so that they have some capital on both sides to then keep ramping up and doing things, either building, renovating on the provider side, or even, you still see M&As every single day. And on the manufacturer side, they're either dropping sort of those verticals that may not be doing very well and other companies are buying them, or vice versa, or making room for them. So there's a lot of different reasons going on, but they want to do it as quickly as possible. And I think that the intelligence that we have these days that you can get in a short amount of time are helping them to do directional market shifts and looking at headwinds and tailwinds a lot better.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. You're basically accusing our colleagues of using data, which is a shocking assertion. But yes, I believe so. I think it's the same thing. I think the other thing that's happening here is the comparison to 2023, which really the first half of 2023 was one of the worst halves, barring cataclysmic episodes like what happened with COVID, et cetera, et cetera. But it was one of the worst, like, non-outside disruptive years that I think the industry's ever had. Okay, coming into the first half, we had a 0.5 point to a 1% growth rate throughout, I believe, 7 to 8 months of the year, which is unheard of. When you look at healthcare, you can pretty much throw a dart at any year starting in 1945 all the way up, and this is going to grow by 3 to 5% like clockwork. Okay, you'll have 1 year where you grow by 9%, another year where you grow by 2%, but it's clockwork, 3 to 5% on average. And we had 2023, which in the first half was 0.5 to 1%. Okay, that's across the board. So of course there were some negatives in there. There was some high flyers at 3.5%. But when you look at it from that perspective, I think what it did is we had this overwhelming sense of fiscal conservatism that took place. And the fiscal conservatism, and we're not going to spend, we're not going to overextend ourselves. Probably some of the CFOs were sitting there and looking at 5.5 points on cash, riskless cash. And, when you've got a multi-billion-dollar portfolio of cash, you can probably get yourself a little bit better than you or I could get at our corner bank account. So they're probably sitting there at 7% of riskless money. Well, this fiscal conservatism, I think, has its roots all over. They weren't expecting the sudden spike in activity in the patient world, because really the spike in census numbers, the spike in procedural volumes kind of started at about late Q3, early Q4 of 2023, and they've continued to go. Right now we're going to be at a higher rate, and I think that fiscal conservatism caused a lot of layoffs, caused a lot of hand-wringing. What are we going to do? And now we're sitting at a point where these companies are trying to do more with less, is really what I think is happening.
Yeah. And at some point during the podcast, we'll probably talk about resilience and how that's a little falling apart just because we get hit with so many things. But to keep on your point, it's that balance of staffing, no matter whether it's providers or not. Do I have the sales force? Do I have a trained sales force? And the other side of the coin on providers, when you do surveys, I've done 3 different surveys in the last 6 months on audiences that are attending value analysis presentations or have a value analysis primary audience. And some of them are mixed supplier value analysis audience, and it's less than 3 years or less of experience. Because I think that you're right. All those COVID years and what we did said we need different people. We might do away with things. Now we have people coming in. But what that happens is if you want to go fast, you don't have the experience to go fast. Yep. So it's a double-edged sword, or whatever we want to use today for the euphemism. But staffing issues are just still critical.
Yeah, hence the question of how we open up the podcast, that insource versus outsource.
Right.
So, why do you think companies, and there's obvious answers to this, but why do you think companies love to insource?
Insource, especially, I'm always going to use the COVID thing at some point, but insource is when you have control over all of your different verticals, all those sorts of things, then you feel you can balance things better. You can flip things. You can, shift people here and there. But what happens at some point is you wind up constraining those folks who can do things really well in your organization, and the others are waiting for things to get done so they can move on in your organization. But these other folks are so busy, they have a hard time getting some of those projects actually done. So you actually bog yourself down a lot when you just be insourced.
Yeah, I agree. I think the primary notion there for insourcing is the idea of control. And if you subscribe to Buddhist philosophy, we know that control is a figment of all of our imaginations. Yet it's the thing that we all try to attain, right? And we try to get control as much as possible. There is safety in control. There is safety in knowing that person, that resource, that thing is mine, and it's verticalized, etc. But there's also what you just said. We have a gap in knowledge. We have a gap in experience right now. And when you're running at full steam, is now the time to be thinking about that. And just because your CFO said, hey, guess what? I will answer your requisition where you asked for 2 people. I know now you've lost 8, but the 2-person requisition that you put in July of 2023, guess what? I'm going to grant it now. And that's what we're hearing from people. And they're saying, yeah, that was a year ago. Now I need 8 people. And we're hearing this repeatedly, right? So the idea of moving to an outsourced capacity sounds a little bit scarier, but I think the idea that many companies need to start to wrap their heads around is insource and outsource doesn't need to be binary, right? Outsource can be a bridge to insourcing. Outsource can be a bridge to giving you the skills, the knowledge, the experience, the staff, the resources, etc., to close that bridge that you currently have. So there's so many companies that look at, oh, we don't outsource, or we don't do this, or we don't do that. But again, they're thinking about it with a binary mindset.
Yeah.
And I think the insource outsource calculus needs to be one where how do you leverage one to help the other? Yes, I agree. I've run an organization. I get it. There's a lot of things that I like better about insource resources. A lot of things, particularly staff. But then there are so many times where you're just left with this deficit of capability where an outsourced person comes right in, right? Using you, Barbara, as a prime example. If companies sit there and try to wrangle with their own value analysis, first of all, they're so caught up in the trees of their forest that they don't see the forest, right? So sometimes you need an outsourced person to tell them, hey, guess what? That thing in front of you is a tree. And there's a lot of other ones out there. You're missing it because you're so myopic in your viewpoint. No fault of your own. You're just caught up in it. That outsource idea, bringing somebody like you in this capacity says, hey, I've seen your forest. I've seen all the forests. Let me tell you why and how to make your forest more pleasant.
Make it the enchanted forest.
Let's make it the enchanted forest, right? Let's bring fairies and fairy dust and unicorns and all that stuff in here and make it really cool to see. Okay. But I think people struggle with that. And that's why I think in these times, there's an equation that says right now there should be more outsourcing than insourcing because you can move faster. When you need to move at the speed of light, outsourcing gives you that capability. Leverage that for your insourcing.
And with outsourcing, it's not like the human resources nightmare, right? If it's not working out, it's gone. And then you figure out, well, we now have some people skilled up, or I get a different skill set in to do something else. So there's a lot of positive things. Yeah.
They're red ink, right? You can get rid of outsource people with a slash of a red pen, as anybody that remembers red pens from their painstaking days of being an elementary school student,
Yeah. I
pre
even keep one in
2000s.
my drawer just in case.
But that's
Yeah.
really all it is. An insource, you have to go through a whole process. There's a whole, bureaucratic red tape with HR and trying to figure
Right.
that nightmare
Well,
out.
it's interesting you say that because I talk to recruiters when I go to meetings. So I've been to 3 meetings. Maybe it's been 4. I may have lost one in the time zone of flying. But I've talked to recruiters, and they're actually having a hard time finding the right people to match up to a lot of these open positions that people really want. So that's another issue out there. So there's a lot of little conundrums, but I think what this sort of exemplifies is when the manufacturers want to go fast, but organizations that they're dealing with are maybe in their slow phase because they don't have a lot of people who have that history or that knowledge. And so the processes may take longer to actually make a connection, and they get very frustrated. But both sides kind of get frustrated because they keep getting inundated with, hey, what's going on? Hey, what's going on? And they're going, we're working as fast as we can, but
Yeah, I think, and the other challenge with all that is also expectation management.
mm,
And
mhm.
what we're seeing from a lot of our clients is the expectations on the behalf of the provider community as they're dealing with their own resource shortages is grown substantially.
Mhm.
Okay. And so one of the things that we do a lot of is obviously implementation and early stage education
Right,
on new
bringing stuff.
technologies. And
Mhm.
what we're seeing from that perspective is because of the challenges on the provider side from a staffing perspective and all the challenges that they have, they're asking the manufacturing and the supplier community for that much more attention,
Yeah.
that much more effort. That you
Mhm.
can't just come in here, drop off boxes. Okay. And you also can't come in here and drop off a box and stay for about 10 minutes, buy some donuts and leave. No, no, no. If you really want us to use that technology and adopt your technology and feel good about it, you have to make an effort because we need you to make an effort. You have to
Mhm.
close that gap that we have because right now, dropping off that box with the box of donuts, it's not going
Yeah.
to work.
What we've been saying in value analysis all year, and every conference I've been to, whether it's a reverse expo or a traditional conference with booths and things, is uh, you're making partnerships. And partnerships are different from relationships, and they're
Yes.
different from the box of donuts.
Yes.
Partners are going to be there all along. And it may not even involve selling more products, but you're gaining those partnerships where you can have that trust and understand that if all of a sudden there's a nursing strike that can go on at any time, at any place, or other strikes, but we can talk about that later. That's a whole nother either podcast or whatever. But you got to help to fill in, just like we learned with COVID, when they were changing products right and left very quickly. Like the next day they had a new product, but then manufacturers had been laying off sales force and people who could interface
Yeah.
because they weren't selling products because they weren't PPE products, right?
Right.
So today it's the IV fluids and then pharmacy having to change so many different things about what they're doing because of the fluids, and then treatments are changing.
Yes.
So you have to have those people with those experiences that understand, what do I do when I don't have the right fluid?
Yeah.
And that's where the inexperience of the 3 years or less kind of comes in on both sides. If you've got a rep or someone helping on the manufacturer side and they came from a copying machine company or something, they're not going to be able to help somebody figure out clinically what else you might be able to do.
Right.
So it's a little interesting conundrum out there.
It really is. But I think that's where the supplier community can look outside of itself. That's where the provider community can look outside of itself.
Mhm.
Is, we talk about this a lot internally, is the concept of multipliers.
Mhm.
Every organization, regardless of what resource you're adding, a person, a activity, some sort of resource with utility attached to it, you have to determine what is the multiplier effect that provides to us. It has to be greater than one. Okay. One, if you're just getting a multiplier effect of one, then really you're just on the hamster wheel. Why are you doing? Right.
Well,
None of us should be running on a treadmill. Feels like we all are. But if you get a multiplier of one, you haven't moved anything. You haven't advanced anything. So
mhm.
anything that you invest in, again, people, resources, outsource, insource, whatever it may be, you have to determine, am I going to get a multiplier greater than one? And what is that?
Right.
Okay. Because the opposite in the binary world of mathematics is a divider. And frankly,
Yeah.
anything less than a one, now this is, I don't need any mathematics majors telling me anything less than a one is, whatever.
Right.
I'm using a very simple dynamic here, but anything less than a one is a divider. It is costing you time. It is costing you extra time. You are
Mhm.
spending more time focused on that resource than the utility is providing you. And that's a challenge.
Mhm.
That in a world where we are all sprinting cannot happen. So therefore, everything we invest our time, money, effort, and resources in, you have to make sure that it is a multiplying effect. And I think that's one of those areas that people need to reevaluate in today's world.
It's interesting you should say it and do it that way, because what you're really talking about is, how do I determine value? High value versus no value versus low value. Same sort of concept. And that's what we would do in the value analysis way, with all the processes we have to be able to do things, is you really look at all those columns, of here's what we're doing, where do we have the biggest gap? And if we fill the biggest gap, then we have less money really going out because we're doing better and going forward. And when you look at all the costs in the long run, you're saving money and that value multiplier goes up.
Yes.
If you've got these big gaps and you're not addressing any of them, or you're only addressing them, like you said, by a one multiplier or something, you're not helping yourself. You're just digging the hole a little
That's
bit
it.
deeper. And it's that timing that's everything, because people can put together a great plan and they can do it quickly, but it's the implementation that takes the longest. And by the time you do that, you've got burned out staff, you've got money not coming in, you're spending more capital that now may be more or less expensive. It's hard to know from any sort of day to day. But then you've got the winter months coming and more sick people. Then you have all these variety of late hurricanes and a variety. Everything's going to keep hitting you. Those tailwinds and especially the headwinds are just going to keep coming. So if you're not constantly doing that gap analysis, and what do I need to do to close that gap? Can I
Yeah.
do it internally? Can I do it externally? But how quickly can I do it in either situation? And what's that cost?
Right. Yeah. No, you're spot on. And I think that's the thing that people are trying to figure out, but it's really that simple, right? Everybody
Mm-hmm.
talks about ROI analysis, but they overcomplicate it. Honestly, you should be able to look at anything and be like, it's going to give me a greater than one multiplier. And there are some things where you're like, that's a 2, 3. Those are unicorns when they
Yeah.
show up, but that has the potential to be a 2, 3 multiplier. The best you
Yeah.
can hope for is a 1.5, which is still substantial on an everyday
It,
basis. So if
it
you
is.
find something, and those are things you can do every day in the proverbial baseball sense, those are singles and doubles, right?
Mm-hmm.
The great teams of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, ones with single doubles. Wasn't until all of a sudden some other people started to realize and think about home runs as being the be all end all. right, in the dynamic, but singles and doubles have always had a profound effect.
Small ball.
Small ball, right? And I
And
think
watching every night, every day, all the playoff stuff started, but Pete Alonso kind of broke your rule last night and did a home run.
he did a home run.
It's
He
only
did have a home
because
run.
there was small ball ahead of him and people were on base. But anyway,
Yeah, he had a home run. Being where I live, that's
I
a
know.
very binary choice. Okay,
I know.
my team is playing tomorrow.
Yes.
So
I'd like to see the two of them play. But anyway,
yes.
we digress here.
We digress.
We
Yes, we
changed
talk about
it
all
into,
subjects.
but you can think about sports in a lot of different ways. And I think by thinking about a lot of these things, sports analogies, we always had a lot of people that said, no, we're in the red zone. How do we get, all that stuff?
Exactly.
Too many of those. But I really do think it is as simple as, what are our gaps? How do we fill them?
Yep.
And you have these, this
short
is
and long term.
This is what strategic planning is all about. Because as we talked about like 3 years ago, a strategic plan is a moving target. It shouldn't just be something like putting the tablets up or, the Constitution or whatever. You've got to continue to look at that.
Yes.
And how is it really going to help? And the one thing is sort of artificial and everything is, we're going to have an end of a fiscal year. But everything continues on regardless of where you draw that line.
Yes,
some people just started their fiscal year a couple of days ago. Some started it in July. Some started in January. But guess what? Patience, making widget, all that stuff keeps going on. So you kind of have to push against some of those walls.
Yes, it does. I agree with you. Well, Barbara, we're reaching the end of our time. Do you have a final thought to leave the audience with?
Final thought is, first of all, our thoughts for healing and rapid recovery, which may take long, and things from what we've seen in the North Carolina, Georgia, people affected in Southwest Virginia, but by all of the water and rains and things. So we wanted to give something heartfelt out there as well. And that we need to look at outcomes. We need to look at value. We need to look at how do we do those things effectively so that everything is matching up. So it's not that providers are ready, manufacturers aren't ready, vice versa. So let's look at insourcing, outsourcing. What do you need to determine to fill gaps, to make things better all the way around? But keep remembering there's a patient at the middle of all of those things.
Yes.
And you just have to think about all of that.
Yep. Agreed. I'm going to leave it with the very simple idea that if you're not multiplying, you're dividing. It's that simple. And I don't believe that in this day and age where things are happening so fast and we have so many things to be doing and getting to and trying to overcome and encounter, that anybody has time for dividing. So you need to sit there, think about what are the resources I need? Who's going to give me the opportunity to multiply in the short term? What's going to give me the best opportunity to multiply in the long term, and address those needs and try to figure out how can you do that. That's what you need when you're running at full speed. So with that, we thank everybody for listening to another episode. We do encourage everybody to listen to our sister podcast, Women of Medtech. And we absolutely want to encourage everybody and wish everybody the best, as Barbara stated, from all those sorely damaged areas from Hurricane Helene. Our thoughts and prayers are with you. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.